What's up, good people of the world? Welcome to Harmonic Part 4, Reverse Extension Harmonization. This is one of my very favorite techniques, and it's especially useful for getting a modern, hip sound out of your progressions while still consistently expressing an emotional aesthetic across the span of a progression, which is very useful in film and game music where the composer has to maintain a certain emotional aura for an extended period of time while still keeping the listener's interest. It's also an effective way to reharmonize an existing melody, which can be an excellent method of developing leitmotifs you've created for characters or locations in the score. The basic foundational principle of reverse extension harmony is very simple, but the possibilities are endless. Before we begin, let's talk briefly about extensions. As I'm sure you're all familiar with, extensions are essentially non-chord tones added onto triads for emotional color. Each one of them has their own aesthetic, and you should intimately familiarize yourself with every possible combination of chord and extension. There are only 12 notes in our Western scale, so this won't take as long as you'd think. The major seventh is a dreamy sound, whereas the minor major seventh is mysterious and evokes James Bond. The dominant flat 9 is sassy. The major add 6 is warm and relaxing, whereas the minor add 6 is murky, like an underwater grotto. Of course, these are my own subjective feelings towards these extensions. You should all, of course, develop your own subjective conceptions of them, which will inevitably make you use them differently from other composers, which will help develop your own original voice. Now, the reason this method is called reverse extension harmonization is because we aren't building extensions off of a bass chord, as is the norm in jazz harmony. Traditional extension harmonization takes an existing melody, chooses particular triads that work well with said melody, and then adds extensions for harmonic color. Whereas reverse extension harmony is the reverse. We pre-plan what extensions we want to use to achieve a particular vertical harmonic color ahead of time, and then choose our chords on that basis. Let's see an example. The melody we're going to be reharmonizing repeatedly throughout the course of this video is this simple cell in A Lydian. But before we begin reharmonizing, we have to choose what extension is going to serve as the basis for the progression. Let's go with minor flat 6, which has a haunting sound that's both dreamy, since it could be heard as a major 7th chord in first inversion, and unsettling because of the sharp semitone dissonance between the 5th and the 6th. Let's return to our melody. Each note is going to have its own chord. Since the first note is A, we want to find the chord above which A is the minor 6th, which in this case is C sharp minor. The important thing to note here is not just the fact that we are using a minor flat 6 chord, but the emotional effect we're going for stems from the fact that the melody specifically is serving as that flat 6. There are 3 other minor flat 6 chords we could use in which the note A belongs: D minor flat 6, F sharp minor flat 6, and A minor flat 6. But only one of them, C sharp minor flat 6, places the melody on the flat 6. Continuing in this manner, we get D sharp minor flat 6 and E sharp minor flat 6, which we're going to respell as F minor flat 6. Then we get G sharp minor flat 6 and G minor flat 6, respelling the D sharp in the melody as an E flat. We still have a long way to go before the progression is polished, but let's hear how just this by itself sounds. So, vertically we've achieved an emotionally consistent string of flat 6 sonorities, which is really nice, but the part motion is currently extremely dull, since everything is moving in parallel. Because the chords are attached to the melody and thus moving with the same contour, we can reverse the motion of the bottom 3 parts, which achieves 2 things. Firstly, it makes the interaction between the harmony and the melody much more interesting horizontally, with the contrary motion, and 2, it enacts function change on all of those lower parts. For example, in this current version, the lowest voice is always functioning as the root of each chord, which makes it seem rather static emotionally as its own contrapuntal line. But by inverting the lower notes, we see that the lowest line's function now changes on every chord. First it's the root of C sharp minor, then the 5th of D sharp minor, then the 3rd of F minor, the root of G sharp minor, and finally the 3rd of G minor. This makes for drastically increased emotional impact in the inner parts. There are a few more things we should do before this progression is satisfactory. First, let's extrapolate it onto a full string section and open up the voicing for a purer sound. Now let's respell the notes inharmonically for clearer reading. When writing for live players, it's generally better to make their individual lines easier to read intervallically rather than dogmatically sticking to the theoretically correct spelling in the context of the chord, especially for more modern progressions like this one. This is a rather controversial topic in music engraving, but my own stance comes solely from asking many dozens of players who perform my music what they would prefer to read, who all unanimously stated that intervallic readability always contributes to a better performance, which is especially true in film scoring recording sessions, where the time crunch forces the composer or engraver to notate their works in such a way that it is learned as efficiently and accurately as possible, and where the musicians are often sight reading.
Why don't we start with some things that are actually harder to do?
Okay.
And some of those things, especially when you're notating music, is to avoid augmented leaps. Like an augmented second should always be written as a minor third.
Okay.
A diminished, you know what I mean? Like when it looks like A to, let me give a good example here, like C natural to D sharp. I would rather see that as a C to E flat. And this comes up a lot when sight reading, when the intervals are hard to read if you're going to have this music played out later by real people. Try to avoid those even if it's different vertically, have it be horizontally sight readable, and that will save you a lot of time, especially when fast, complicated 16th note passages. Somebody, usually, hopefully a string player, is proofreading that part, and that'll avoid issues.
Finally, let's smooth out the voice leading. When dealing with four-part writing, for legato passages such as this one, it's generally a good idea to take advantage of oblique motion from one chord to another, that is, to tie common notes together for a smoother sound. Now, if we were dealing with functional diatonic harmony, this would be a lot easier, as we're much more likely to have common notes between one chord and the next, as shown in this example. In our modern extension progression, we can still create common notes where none seem to exist by use of suspensions and anticipations. But before I explain these, let's review the three different types of diatonic chord relationships. If we're trying to create oblique motion in diatonic four-part writing, the first thing that we need to do is figure out how many notes we have in common between one chord and the next. The easiest way to do this is to categorize chords into three categories. First, we have our mediant and submediant relationship. So if we're in the key of C major, our mediant is going to be a third above tonic, E minor in this case, and the submediant is going to be A minor, going downward by a third. Okay? These mediants and submediants have two notes in common with the chord that we're on, so they're very easy to voice lead and create oblique motion. So for example, if we were to go from C major to E minor in four-part writing, you can see the motion is very smooth because we have this E and this G, which belongs to E minor as well as C major. Same thing with A minor, right? We can hold two notes over for a smooth transition, and it's because this C and this E belongs to C major as well as A minor. Okay, so mediant and submediant relationships are very easy to create oblique motion with because you have two notes with which you can hold over into the next chord. So the next relationship that we have is going to be your dominant and your subdominant. So your dominant is going down a fourth from tonic, and your subdominant is going up a fourth from tonic, right? So in this case, in the case of C major, it would be F major and G major, right? So with F major, we have the C in common between C major and F major. And with G major, we have the G in common between C major and G major, right? So when part writing, dominant to tonic, you can see we can hold this note. And when going from tonic to subdominant, we can hold the C, right? So we have one note in common. So sometimes you may not be able to create oblique motion if you're using inversions, but generally it's pretty easy with dominant and subdominant relationships to create oblique motion because you do have that one note in common. Now, chords where, under normal circumstances, it's impossible to create oblique motion without modifying the chord somewhat or using other techniques, which we're going to talk about, is adjacent chords. Now, in the key of C major, if we're going to continue with our typical nomenclature, we might call this supertonic and leading tone, but since that's really only descriptive of a chord's relationship to its tonic, we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to call them adjacent chords. Adjacent chords are chords that are right next to the chord that you're on by a step, right? So if we were going to go, for example, F major, G major, A minor, right? Those are all adjacent chords. They're right next to each other, and because they're right next to each other, we have no notes in common. So, how do we take chords that have no notes in common and make them have notes in common where none exist? This adjacent progression, where neither chords have any notes in common, can be smoothed over with, you guessed it, suspension and anticipation. In diatonic harmony, this can be done with any part so long as no part writing rules are broken, and often both can be used simultaneously, as in this example. The last thing we can do to make the voice leading as smooth as possible is by filling in leaps with stepwise motion. In the second violins, we can fill in that leap of a third with a passing tone. When doing this, however, take care to avoid parallels that might accidentally arise unless you really want them. The best way to avoid this issue is borrowing the idea of rhythmic independence from counterpoint, where the composer tries to give each part motion at different times, so that they can all converse back and forth, so to speak, rather than talking over each other. This principle excludes imperfect consonances such as thirds and sixths, which sound great in parallel for reasons I won't get into in the scope of this video. In the case of this progression, even though filling in this third would give parallel sixths between second violin and viola, I personally prefer rhythmic independence, so I'm going to give the seconds a dotted quarter rhythm to displace the passing tone. Now, let's get to the part you came for and apply those techniques to the extension progression. First, let's fill in the leaps in the inner parts. Since this isn't a diatonic chord progression, you might wonder what notes we should choose when creating passing tones. The answer is simple. We simply build a scale out of the chord we're on. We can choose any scale we like so long as it works with the chord, but in my experience, you'll get a more coherent, less weird for the sake of being weird sound if you try and stick to one consistent scale across the span of a phrase. Since we're using minor flat 6 chords, we could use Aeolian, aka natural minor, or Phrygian, or harmonic minor, or even some Indian thoughts if we wanted, but I'm just going to stick with Aeolian for this progression. Sometimes we could choose a note from the chord ahead of us rather than the one that we're on, but that only works in specific cases and often sounds like a wrong note if not handled properly. Always experiment, don't let rules bog you down, but in all cases let your ear make the final decision on whether or not a musical decision you make reflects the desired aesthetic for a particular passage of music. For the cello passing tone, we're going to use B since it belongs to C-sharp Aeolian. For the second violins, we'll use C-sharp since it belongs to G-sharp Aeolian. The viola presents a tricky situation because, although we'd naturally want to use an E natural, that still doesn't smooth out the leap of a third. It just changes it from a major third to an augmented second, which pretty much sounds identical to a minor third, especially in this non-diatonic context. We can't temporarily splurge by opting for Dorian and using an E sharp because that would cause a direct chromatic clash with the melody, which is playing, of course, E natural, the flat 6. In cases like these, it's usually best to just leave it as is and not overly fiddle with it, as tinkering with such a finely tipped compositional pen often sounds contrived. After all, leaps aren't inherently evil, and there are many other ways we can smooth out the voice leading. Also, if we leave it as it is, it gives it more independence from the second violins. You might have noticed that there is in fact one lucky note we can hold over in the cellos, so let's go ahead and take advantage of that. But before we continue, let's listen to what we have so far. Delicious. I'm not utterly convinced by the cello line. It needs more than just the B to effectively tonicize C-sharp Aeolian, so I'm going to add an embellished figuration with an additional neighbor tone to imply the key more clearly. That's better. Also, the stepwise motion we added in the seconds really brings out that dissonant flat 9 interval between them and the first violin, so I'm going to quasi-resolve the dissonant rub with a voice exchange between the seconds and the violas. Voice exchange is simply when two voices, or parts, exchange notes, usually with octave displacement. In this case, the viola is taking over the seconds D and vice versa. This displaces the flat 9 to a less salient flat 16, where it grates less in our ears since the second and fourth partials in the overtones aren't in as close proximity. There we go, much more pleasing to listen to now. In order to use an anticipation, we simply have to spot one note that works with two adjacent chords. We can see one right here. This A flat, theoretically spelled as a G sharp, can function both as the fifth of C sharp minor as well as the fourth of D sharp minor, and can be held over, then resolved downward in a 4-3 suspension. I don't see any effective way that we can seam up the D sharp minor to F minor change. We could create another 4-3 suspension in the cello since its A sharp can carry over as B flat, the fourth of F minor, but the syncopated rhythm that would result from that decision would be stylistically out of place in this context to my taste, so we'll just leave it as is. Again, better not to fiddle too much just to achieve a rule consistently. Better to let the music breathe and do what it wants to do. Again, the key to this progression sounding emotionally impactful and coherent rather than unpleasantly strange and nonsensical is the fact that the melody is consistently playing the role of flat 6. That consistency guides our ears throughout the entire progression and helps us make sense of the horizontally arbitrary chord choices on grounds of consistency of vertical sonority and melodic function. Finally, let's dress it up with some orchestration and hear how it might sound in the context of a piece. Also, remember, that's just one small example, and there are hundreds upon hundreds of extension combinations we could use. Did this progression sound a little too dissonant for your ears? No problem. Choose a more consonant extension as its basis. We could use a major 7th, or a Lydian sharp 4, or a Dorian 6th, or a Phrygian flat 9, an octatonic or whole tone cluster, a chordal polychord, or even use set theory to create non-triadic chord shapes based on intervals. I was going to give you several more examples, but rather than do that, I encourage you to go try this out for yourself. Also, this technique doesn't have to be used exclusively. It can be integrated into other harmonic styles, and you can even use alternating extensions rather than sticking to one specific one the entire progression. That about wraps up this video. If you value these tutorials, consider becoming a patron, where you can gain access to an exclusive email address with which you can reliably communicate with me at any time to ask questions or get a monthly Skype lesson. Happy composing. See you next time. With which you can reliably communicate with me at any time to ask questions. That is such a tongue twister.
Reliable. Yeah, a little bit. You gotta slow that down a little bit. You're going so fast, it's like, it sounds like you're saying aliens.